So welcome to part two of our lecture on Latin America from independence. And here we're going to be, in a sense, engaging in a kind of more conventional kind of history where we're focusing on events, individuals, and in this case, pertaining in a kind of more narrow way to three specific countries in Latin America, very large ones, whether we're talking about population, economically, or in terms of even territory, and certainly in terms of impact. And those three nation states are Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. We'll start with Argentina, whose national history from this period is often broken down into three phases, right? So the first kind of running from when it became independent, its rebellion against Spain in 1810 until the middle of the 19th century. And then running between 1853 and 1916. And this is a period of tremendous economic expansion, but also a huge number of immigrants coming from Europe during this period, settling in Argentina. And then finally, 1916 to 1943, during which Argentina is, in a sense, attempting to establish itself as a democratic state, but falls short. So if we start with phase one, we might also characterize this phase as really being defined in large measure by this kind of conflictual relationship that emerges between Buenos Aires and the other provinces of what till then had been known as the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, right, which had just become independent from Spain, 1810, and almost immediately the other regions are refusing to accept the leadership of Buenos Aires, which had played a dominant political role during the period of Spanish rule, right? So again, kind of the porteños, a term even until today used to designate the inhabitants of Buenos Aires versus the provincials. And that is pretty much going to define the next 70 years of Argentinian history. Eventually, Buenos Aires will establish its primacy largely by virtue of dominating trade, which becomes increasingly important, right? So any trade happening within Rio de la Plata with the outside world pretty much runs through Buenos Aires. More specifically, that will put Buenos Aires in control of the International Custom House, a very important source of revenue. And of course, that also becomes a factor in Buenos Aires' ability to dominate what will become Argentina. Now, pretty much right from the start, there will be attempts at defining a kind of more federal political structure that would centralize authority within Buenos Aires. This is going to start with the first president of the then Rio de la Plata, what will eventually become Argentina, Bernardino Rivadavia. And ultimately he fails, right? He really isn't able to overcome this kind of regionalism where each region feels very much autonomous. But he is, in a sense, kind of laying the foundation for what will eventually define the political structure of Argentina. Perhaps the most important development during his presidency will be when he negotiates a commercial treaty with Great Britain in 1823, heavily linking the two countries. And you might remember in the first part of the lecture, we talked a bit about how Great Britain early on is the dominant trading partner for pretty much all of Latin America. But even, this is even especially so in the case of Argentina. Now, you might also remember from the first part of the lecture, we talked about how periodically in Latin American countries, you would see the emergence of what's known as a caudillo, a kind of political strongman who ultimately would often govern effectively as a dictator. So the first example of that in Argentina is going to be following Rivadavia's resignation in 1827, after which the Buenos Aires strongman Juan Manuel de Rosas became the kind of dominant political figure in Argentina, and effectively would rule as a dictator, right? So, in some ways, a lot of continuity here. It's not that he's pursuing policies that are completely different than what had been happening under Rivadavia, particularly in terms of expansion of trade and agriculture. Perhaps the suppression of indigenous peoples kind of picking up. and becoming a bit more important at this point, kind of promoting a more nationalistic outlook, right? Trying to generate a sense of patriotism towards Argentina as a whole. Definitely, we're also seeing a continuation of a process by which Buenos Aires becomes the dominant political partner vis-a-vis the various regions. In 1831, negotiating the Pact of the Littoral, which basically puts Buenos Aires in charge of foreign relations, trade, and cements its control of the custom house, very important source of revenue, even while allowing the other provinces to manage their own internal affairs. And to make no mistake, right, as a caudillo, Juan Manuel de Rosas definitely governing as a dictator, not allowing civil liberties or any kind of dissent. Very repressive regime with a security agency, something kind of the equivalent of the KGB, with the Soviet Union. Maybe not quite as effective in terms of the kind of technology available, but no doubt striking fear into the hearts of anyone who crossed his path, right? Known as the mazorca, which means ear of corn, sounds innocuous enough, but again, definitely an organization which you wouldn't really want to get onto their radar back in that time. Now, there is going to be a bit of a pushback in terms of Buenos Aires becoming increasingly dominant, and that will be a factor in seeing a new caudillo overthrow Rosas. In this case, Justo José de Urquiza of a different region, Entre Rios. And so, again, partly motivated by a desire to prevent Buenos Aires from becoming too dominant, related to which they're going to promulgate a new federal constitution, which is going to lessen the influence of Buenos Aires, and is in fact something imposed on Buenos Aires in 1859. In principle, it means that the various not just that the other regions would be more independent, but would also kind of sever Buenos Aires from its own hinterland, right? From kind of separating it from what becomes defined as a distinct federal province. But in the end, really, maybe, kind of slowing the trajectory down a bit, but Buenos Aires is going to continue to become increasingly dominant. And this is primarily because of its growing economic importance, right? It's just becoming the most prosperous part of Argentina, and that will ensure its continued importance moving forward. And if we're talking about Argentina's economic development, and again, this kind of corresponds to kind of the broader trends that we talked about with respect to Latin America as a whole in the first part of the lecture, right? Whereby economies are geared primarily to providing raw materials for Europe and then later for the United States. In the case of Argentina, initially we're talking primarily about wheat and beef. So there is a lot of economic development, infrastructure development, and so forth, but everything is really geared towards kind of expanding production of these raw materials, right? So you do have improvements in transportation, technology, but a lot of this is really about how to preserve beef, for instance, through refrigeration, which then makes it increasingly possible to transport large quantities of Argentine beef to Europe. With respect to wheat farming, it becomes primarily about opening new territories to wheat production. A lot of this is going to be directed at the southern part of Argentina, Las Pampas. You have this campaign known as the Conquest of the Desert, and it should note that this will result in the displacement of large numbers of indigenous peoples who have been living there. And finally, we might note that they're going to get a lot of help from the British, right? We talked about, again, how the British are going to be very dominant economically in Latin America. In the case of Argentina, not just with respect to trade, right, but also in helping to develop the necessary infrastructure in order to ensure that the goods they want from Argentina are produced, are able to get to port, and are able to make their way to Britain and other parts of Europe, right? So the British are going to become heavily invested in constructing and managing railways to carry wheat from the interior to the coast. And then we might note that very often that wheat is being loaded onto British steamships. Certainly other foreign steamships But the main point is most of this infrastructure is not being developed by Argentina, or at least solely by it, and most of it ends up being owned by foreign countries. Whatever the case, you're going to see a period of rapid economic development, much of it centering on the opening of new lands in the Pampas. This is going to inspire hundreds of thousands of Europeans to migrate to Argentina, many of them coming from Spain and Italy. And by the way, it's worth noting, if we consider even today the demographics, the ethnic demographics of Argentina, much bigger European component than what you find in many other Latin American countries. And a lot of that reflects, this kind of large-scale migration of Europeans during this period. Now, all of them coming seeking their fortunes, aspiring maybe to have their own farm or to get wealthy in newly developing industries, and probably many of them ending up disappointed. I mean, many of them are going to end up as tenant farmers, large numbers in the cities working in food processing and the service and transportation industries, all of which is kind of tied into, the fact that Argentina's primary economic activities are, basically producing raw materials for export. And so, many of them are not going to become quite as wealthy as they perhaps imagined when they got on the boat. Nonetheless, right, I mean, Argentina is going to become increasingly urbanized and industrialized in connection with this. And this is going to lead to a growing social discontent. And eventually, this is going to challenge the political status quo, right? And as we talked about in the first lecture, during the first part of the 19th century, as in most parts of Latin America, the dominant political group here are the conservative landed elite, right? In fact, we can talk about a limited number of families who are very influential, i.e. oligarchy. They constitute the governing class. And as is often the case with people who've been in power for a long time, they do not realize just how tenuous their situation was becoming. So up until now, they pretty much have ignored social problems related to indigenous peoples, to landless peasants, with a newly emerging working class. Probably their big mistake is, now that you have kind of an emerging middle class, very often connected to certain professions, these are individuals who have political aspirations, and the governing elite will ignore them as well, right? They're educated individuals, people who are starting to acquire wealth, and they feel they should have a greater share in political life. And at some point, they will organize, beginning in 1890 as the Radical Party. And so, it's not going to happen overnight. First few times running in elections, they don't do very well. But then at some point, they expand the franchise in terms of who can vote, and they provide for a secret ballot. And one thing that might have inhibited people in their voting behavior was the fear of, retaliation. For instance, if you voted for someone, if you were on record for voting for someone that the governing elite frowned upon, right? So you didn't have to worry about that. And that will actually work tremendously to the advantage of the Radical Party. Most notably when in 1916 their leader is elected president, Hipólito Irigoyen. And, initially it's not clear whose interests he's looking out for, right? There's even a feeling that he's looking out for the working class. He's demonstrated some sympathy for labor. But that is very quickly going to change, right? At some point he begins using the military against strikers. Probably the most famous episode of this was during La Semana Trágica, which saw him crush a general strike in Buenos Aires in January 1919. From that point forward, and it's not just him, right? The Radical Party as a whole will increasingly align itself with elite landowners and urban business interests that are kind of coming together in opposition to the working class. But eventually he will be removed from power by the military, which stages a coup in 1930. And at some point it's interesting, the military, and we talked about this also in the first part of the lecture, very often, if you're talking about the military officers, highly educated individuals who view themselves as progressives, and many of whom in this case are feeling that Argentina needs to reform politically and economically in order to progress, to move forward. and that the Radical Party is not moving fast enough. Now, after this, we're going to see the emergence of a new movement, which is semi-fascist in character. And bearing in mind, this is the 1930s, so this is actually a kind of global phenomena. In this case, a movement known as nacionalismo, which is actively promoted by, initially it's primarily like something promoted by intellectuals, writers, political journalists. You have a few politicians who are kind of part of the movement early on. And we should note that even though it's kind of semi-fascist, to some degree it is directed at social problems, right? Kind of advocating social reforms to address the needs of workers and the poor. But in some ways, right, I mean, it does find certain parallels with fascism in general. In this case, kind of being rooted in certain traditional principles. In the case of Argentina, corresponding to the Catholic Church, very anti-communistic. So in part recognizing that communism feeding off, kind of the social problems confronting working class people and so forth. But it's also kind of fascist in the sense that it really imagines a very strong central government kind of imposing its will on the population. They really see Juan Manuel de Rosas, this caudillo from earlier on, as a role model. So very authoritarian in outlook, even if socially concerned. And we should note also very anti-imperialistic, which is kind of a manifestation of a, very much nationalistic perspective, right? Kind of resenting the overarching influence of foreign entities. Initially it's primarily Great Britain and Europe, increasingly United States beginning to play a role in Latin America and so forth. Which brings us to World War II, which is going to have a devastating impact on Argentina, particularly economically, right? Kind of effectively cutting Argentina off from its most important markets, which are in Europe. And this is going to result in an economic crisis and then eventually a military coup after the military leaders become impatient with politicians who just seem incapable of addressing the economic and social problems confronting the country, mostly because of corruption, the fact that they're more interested in pursuing their own individual interests and so forth. And this is where you're really going to see a kind of emerging correspondence between the role of the military, this nacionalismo movement, and this kind of sympathy for fascism in Europe. Many of the officers were the children of immigrants. They're fiercely patriotic. We should know part of the sympathy they feel towards fascism and even the Nazis really has to do with the fact that Germany is at war with Great Britain, increasingly seen as Argentina's chief nemesis, kind of representing more than any other country the specter of foreign control. And so, they're really going to promote the idea that the government, first of all, in a very direct way, needs to address social questions, but also Argentina needs to liberate itself from kind of, European or even American imperial influence, right? This idea, and this is mostly defined in economic terms. The country needs to industrialize so it can liberate itself from foreign economic control. And all of this is, in a sense, setting the stage for, probably the movement or ideological / political movement most associated with Argentina, Peronism, right? This one, in a sense, kind of building off nacionalismo, but in a sense connecting many of the elements of that movement to the person of one individual, Juan Perón, who had been one of the military leaders, a colonel involved in the 1943 coup, but now is going to emerge as the dominant political figure in Argentina. And he's going to create a new political movement, again, very much kind of building off nacionalismo, but again, tying it to himself. Like nacionalismo, emphasizing the idea that the government needs to be authoritarian in order to deal with social issues. Has a very kind of socially progressive outlook, and of course very much anti-communist, and primarily seeking to attract support from the working class and trade unions. It presents itself as the voice of working class democracy. And eventually Perón will be elected president, and pretty much governs exactly as you would expect, right? In a fairly authoritarian manner. He is in some ways the embodiment of the, kind of the 20th century version of the caudillo, and probably most famously, and this is maybe the reason many people have heard of Peronism, he gets tremendous support from his wife, a former actress, very charismatic individual named Eva Duarte, who very often goes by the name Evita. Somehow this is the name that she prefers that working class poor people use when interacting with her, and then eventually will become the subject of a Broadway play and film. In the end, he does do some things to address some of the social ills confronting Argentina. Not really a lot in order of, kind of industrializing Argentina, and eventually he will be ousted in 1955. And this is a pretty good ending point for developments in Argentina. We now turn to Mexico, which some historians, if we're talking about the first part of its history as an independent country, have characterized it as one of a thwarted social revolution, in large measure reflecting the fact that for the first century of independence, conservative forces will dominate politically, starting with, in fact, monarchy. The first ruler of independent Mexico will be an emperor, Agustin de Iturbide, who will rule until 1823. After that, we won't have any more kings, but pretty much it's the same basic deal. Succession of presidents, most of which are caudillos, generally coming from the army, or at the very least enjoying strong support from the army. Probably the most famous would be Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was a general and probably best described as a political opportunist in the sense that he wasn't really driven by any particular ideological agenda. And possibly what most defines Santa Anna's presidency will be Mexico's interactions with the United States, which is mostly conflictual and mostly results in Mexico losing a great deal of territory to an expanding United States, right? So we might start with 1823 when the U.S. begins to colonize parts of Texas. You should note initially with the permission of the Mexican government, but at some point the American settlers there are going to grow to resent some of Santa Anna's policies. They rebel in 1835. Eventually Santa Anna has to send the army in. And probably the most famous encounter in this regard is going to be when the Mexican army basically annihilates the defenders of a fortress structure known as the Alamo, right? And so, very famous slogan emerges from this, remember the Alamo. Today if you go to Texas, a major tourist destination is what remains of that structure. In the end, it's not the defining encounter, which is probably the Battle of San Jacinto, where the Mexican army is defeated, and the result being Texas is lost to Mexico, initially as an independent republic, but then shortly thereafter annexed by the United States. But it doesn't end there. In 1846, there are going to be border clashes with the United States that eventually leads the American president, James Polk, to launch a war against Mexico. And that pretty much results in the United States gaining huge expanse of land, right? Pretty much all the territories corresponding to present-day New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And Santa Anna is going to have to deal with some problems at home as well. At some point, we see the emergence around the middle of the 19th century of a political movement specifically directed against Santa Anna's autocratic style of government, even while advocating specific kinds of reform, right? So it's a kind of form of liberalism, promoting rapid progressive change, but very much associated with anti-clericalism, right? So in many ways, not directed only against Santa Anna, but also against the church, and among other things, calling for the confiscation of church lands. Definitely opposed to excessive military influence in politics. and at some point it will become the dominant element in the legislature, on the basis of which it begins to pass legislation aimed at breaking up large landed estates, right? Much of that owned by the church, but not only them. And the idea is that you could alleviate many of these social and economic problems confronting the vast majority of Mexican peasants by providing them land, right? So by taking over these large landed estates, confiscating them, you could then break them up into a much larger number of small farms that could then be distributed among the poor peasants. The legislation is pretty well-meaning, right? But unfortunately is poorly formulated and ends up, partly because of that, backfiring. The content of the laws that result from this legislation actually end up allowing large landowners to purchase additional land cheaply. So it has the unintended consequence of making many large estates even larger. Eventually, La Reforma taking on a much more militaristic character, and this kind of reflects the fact that Mexico is becoming heavily divided at this point between conservative and liberal forces, right? So conservatives, to some degree, representing primarily the interests of the land-owning elite, but also as correspond to the status of the Roman Catholic Church. Liberals representing the interests of the peasantry. Eventually, under their leader, Benito Juarez, La Reforma is going to militarily take over Mexico City, and Juarez will become Mexico's first and last Amerindian president, right? The first and only Amerindian or Native American, someone of pure Native American descent to hold the office of president. And so, now they control the government. They're going to actively promote their liberal agenda, to some degree focusing on anti-church legislation, going after the church's privileges. This is only going to exacerbate the divisions that have emerged in Mexico, leading to a great deal of civil strife between 1857 and 1860, and eventually conservative forces taking over again, forcing Juarez to flee the city. In large measure, that the conservatives are able to take control again is because they have European support, military support, right, in the form of the British Army, the Spanish Army, and oddly enough, the French Army. Right? With the Spanish, a lot of this has to do with the fact that they were formerly the colonial mother country. The British are concerned about their economic interests in Mexico. With the French, it's going to largely reflect the fact that the ruler at the time is Napoleon III. We already talked about how he has this pressure to live up to the reputation of his more famous uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, so looking for some kind of win abroad. But also corresponding to the fact that increasingly France is presenting itself as a defender of the Roman Catholic Church, something we already saw at play with respect to the Crimean War. So that will, kind of be the determinative factor in France's involvement in this particular enterprise. And ultimately, this is going to lead to the installation of an Austrian Habsburg Archduke, Maximilian, as Mexico's emperor, right? Something that Mexico's conservatives view favorably, but if you really think about it, doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. This is an individual who, whether based on his own personal political history or based on, if we're thinking about the Habsburg dynasty, there's really no connection here with Mexico. And in the end, his ability to stay in power is going to become dependent on French military support, particularly after the British and Spanish leave. And at some point, the French are going to have to leave. Now, to his credit, he tries to find some kind of middle ground between conservatives and liberals, but this only serves to alienate both sides. And as soon as the French leave, he's pretty much a dead duck. Right? By 1867, Juarez has organized strong resistance to the conservatives, is able to retake control of the government, takes Maximilian prisoner, and has him executed. And so now the liberals are in control of the government, but they're, in a sense, going to fail to rally any support, partly by focusing too much on their anti-church legislation, which is going to alienate even a fair amount of the peasantry, many of whom, in a religious sense, are fairly conservative. And eventually this is going to result in a military coup by a fellow named Porfirio Díaz, who, claiming to support the liberal agenda, believes that the politicians have run astray and seizes power supposedly to restore the republic, right? But in the end, he is going to govern as a dictator. He will retain the presidency until 1911, and using the typical tools of a dictator to maintain his power, right? Repression of political opponents, bribery to shore up support where he can. Having said that, we should note that some of his policies will prove relatively successful. So first of all, in terms of shoring up his support, for someone who claims to support the liberal agenda, will do a lot to benefit landowners, right? They're, for instance, allowing them to purchase public land cheaply. Liberals supposedly were trying to minimize the influence of the army in politics, but he kind of understands that if he wants to stay in power, he needs their support. So we'll promote a lot of policies that favor the army. And as far as the church, while some of these kind of anti-clerical measures will remain on the books, he won't do much to enforce them. So in this sense, striking a modus vivendi with the church. Probably where he is most successful is in developing the economy, but in this case, primarily by bringing in foreign capital investment, most of which at this point is going to come from the United States. And of course, one of the most important elements of the liberal policy agenda had been land redistribution, right? To appropriate, large landed estates, or at least some of them, from the landowning elite, and then break this down into smaller farms and redistribute that to the peasantry. So not much happening in that vein. Many peasants still lacking land. There's this growing resentment of the ever-growing power of the landlords, many of them becoming even more wealthy under Diaz. And then we have problems with the working class, right? Working class is beginning to develop with, kind of limited industrialization, mostly in kind of textiles and mining. And so they're doing pretty poorly as well, owing to inflation, stagnating wages. We're starting to see a lot of labor unrest. Strikes are becoming more common, and Diaz is responding to these primarily by using military force against workers. So by 1910, what many had kind of seen as a Pax Porfiriana, this kind of peaceful, stable situation in Mexico under his rule, was rapidly unraveling. And so by 1910, Diaz is being opposed in his bid for re-election by Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner but someone who claims to be a moderate liberal. Now, Madero loses the election, but this is going to result in an insurrection which he will lead in May 1911, which will drive Diaz out of power. He will go into exile in Europe. But as it turns out, Madero is not really a force for liberalism. He ends up alienating both liberals, who resent his apparent unwillingness to engage in any serious agrarian reform, any kind of policies that would improve the lot of the peasantry, including land redistribution, but also alienating conservatives who do not want to change anything at all. And it's against this backdrop that we're going to kind of see the peasantry really taking control of their own situation, right? Kind of promoting their own interests. Until now, very often you kind of have this dynamic where it seems they're looking for leadership either from the military or from some kind of a large landowner who favors liberal reform. Now the peasants taking charge of their own situation, in a sense, right? We see the emergence of radical leaders coming from amongst the peasantry. Most famous of which are Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, right? Pancho Villa operating in the north of Mexico, Zapata in the south, both calling for essentially the same thing, calling for mass rallies of peasants in support of fundamental structural changes in rural land holdings, right? Or to put it more simply, land redistribution. And in 1911, Zapata is actually going to promote a very specific and fairly detailed plan for how to carry that out. His plan of Ayala, a program of large-scale peasant confiscation of land. And at this point, Madero unable to effectively govern. He's literally being squeezed between, on the one side, the conservative supporters of Diaz, who had just been forcibly removed. On the other side, these radical peasant revolutionaries. And the outcome of this is going to be yet another military coup, in this case headed by General Victoriano Huerta, who is backed by the United States and will effectively become yet another caudillo or dictator. He will eventually be opposed, however, by, and so again we see someone from the land-owning elite taking on a leadership role on behalf of liberalism, in this case Venustiano Carranza, who is going to head up what he actually creates, a constitutionalist army in support of Pancho Villa's cause, right? Among other things, calling for the restoration of the Constitution, hence the name of the army. And eventually, the Constitutionalist army will win out. Huerta's government collapses, the Constitutionalist army enters Mexico City, and we have a new government, right? This transpires on August 15th, 1914. But before too long, we find Carranza falling out with Villa and Zapata, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that he seems a bit reluctant, at least from their point of view, to really fully embrace their program of agrarian reform. Certainly not on the scale they were hoping for, and maybe not entirely surprising given that it came from the land-owning elite. And this is eventually going to result in a great deal of civil strife. We could say the Mexican Revolution is fully underway. But we shouldn't underestimate Carranza. He's really proves to be very savvy in the ensuing conflict, and he's really able to kind of actively promote himself as this patriot and nationalist, someone really looking out for Mexico. Partly because he's really good at taking advantage of different situations when they arise. A really good example of that would be when the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson sends U.S. Marines to Veracruz in April of 1914 in support of Carranza. But he kind of recognizes, I suppose, it's not a good look to have the backing of the United States, and so he actually denounces the move and presents himself as someone seeking to liberate, or shall we say, protect Mexico from American intervention. And eventually this forces the Marines to depart. Right? So this is a good example of how he's able to take a situation and then kind of manipulate it to his advantage. By 1917, Carranza is definitely the dominant figure politically, and also in a sense kind of the leading figure for the cause of reform, related to which in that year he's going to draft a new constitution, the Constitution of 1917, wherein he expounds a program of social and political reform. We should highlight two articles here that are going to prove very influential with respect to later developments. So first we have Article 27, which gives ownership of water, mineral rights, and other subsoil property rights to the government. It also abrogates any pre-revolutionary contracts with foreign companies. So in a sense, here we see Carranza once again standing up to foreign influence. And it also opens up the possibility of peasant villages reclaiming lost land. Article 123, guaranteeing certain rights for the organization of labor. In truth, the implementation of provisions like this are going to take years to be carried out. It'll be years before they're actually enforceable, but it does lay the foundation for further change. And we should note, Carranza, by this point, a fairly popular figure, especially in the northwestern part of Mexico, where he has many admirers. We should note also, right, you have many individuals there who are looking at developments in California And, they're looking at it with a bit of envy, right? They're seeing a lot of economic progress take place, and there's kind of a feeling that this could provide a model for Mexico by which it might modernize. But a big part of this would involve trying to attract foreign investments. That kind of runs against the grain a bit of, for instance, that one aspect of Article 27 that, is trying to, in a sense, minimize foreign influence in the economy. In any event, by the end of the revolution, one thing is clear. This is a revolution of the middle class. I mean, they will emerge on top. They will govern the country. There is a recognition that the social problems confronting the peasantry need to be addressed. But, rather than actually finding a way to give the peasantry a space within the political system by which they might represent their own interests, it's kind of more the idea that we're going to look out for them, right? A kind of enlightened paternalism. As kind of father figures looking out for the children. Just to kind of wrap up, the story of these three individuals, during the waning days of the revolution, all three will be killed. Carranza, Zapata, and Villa will all be killed. And this will pretty much leave the new government in the charge of military leaders drawn from the Constitutionalist Army, under whom reform, at least initially, will be pretty slow going moving forward. So we should note one last development with the conclusion of the Mexican Revolution. We're going to see the establishment of a new political party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, better known simply as the PRI. This is initiated by Plutarco Elias Calles in 1929, initially known as the National Revolutionary Party, shortly thereafter becoming the PRI. On the face of it, this might seem like a really good step towards democracy. But the thing is, for many decades to come, you really are going to have just this one single party dominating the political landscape in just about every way. Right. So if you really think about it, all that really has happened here is that instead of having a single strong leader, a caudillo type figure dominating Mexico politically, you're going to have a strong political party fulfilling the same role. And with that, we see what we might call the revolutionary era kind of winding down. Before it comes to a complete end, we will see some progress made on the cause of social reform, and a lot of credit should be given to Lázaro Cárdenas, who was elected president in 1934 and will fulfill many of the promises of the Constitution of 1917, mostly through bureaucratic and administrative channels, so rather peacefully. So two really good examples of the kind of progress he's going to initiate. He will turn tens of millions of acres of land over to peasant villages. And in 1938, and this actually is going to have far-reaching ramifications, he will nationalize the oil industry under Pemex, the Mexican National Oil Company. With the election of his successor, Manuel Ávila Camacho, pretty much we see an end to this era of revolutionary politics in Mexico, and to some degree, a tremendous slowing down of the cause of social reform. And that brings us to the third of the three countries that we're examining more closely, and that would be Brazil. In some ways, very similar to what we saw in Mexico, where the first several decades after independence is primarily about maintaining the old elite in power, right? So, and again, as in Mexico, we're going to see monarchy, at least initially. In fact, the first 67 years of its independence, Brazil will have monarchical government, relatively stable. Really, everything is about maintaining the status quo, a big part of which is the institution of slavery, which will remain until 1888. And in fact, the first emperor of Brazil is going to be Pedro I, who had been the regent of Brazil, representing the king, his father, the King of Portugal, at the time of independence. In fact, he had put himself at the head of the independence movement in the period leading up to that break, which, not to doubt his sincerity, but a pretty savvy political move. Unfortunately, he would fall out of favor shortly thereafter, in large measure because he wasn't doing enough to promote the interest of the Brazilian elite, rather favoring Portuguese courtiers. And there was also some resentment of his kind of high-handed style of rule, even though he did grant a constitution in 1823, and eventually he was forced to abdicate, to step down in 1831. That would see his son Pedro II take the throne. He would prove to be a pretty capable ruler, not least in at least kind of creating the illusion of constitutional monarchy. So, I mean, kind of nothing really stipulated in that regard in the Constitution, and most power did reside in his hands, but he basically called upon both the conservative and liberal political parties to form ministries, right? So we can at least have the facade of a proper kind of constitutional government. Now, the burning issue during this period is going to be slavery, right? There's kind of a growing recognition, at least among some part of the population, that this institution really, there's something wrong with it. It needs to go. Though very often, whatever your position is, has a lot to do with the economics of it, right? So, for instance, those involved in sugar production, right, who the owners of large sugar plantations, many of them based in the coastal provinces, tended to support slavery, very resistant to change, largely because the growing of sugar was a slave-intensive kind of enterprise, right? I mean, pretty much without slave labor, you couldn't make a profit from it. That's basically the bottom line. It's just too labor intensive. If you had to pay for the labor, if you had what they call free labor, as in, people are free who you actually have to pay for their work, it would be cost prohibitive. On the other hand, you have individuals who are engaged in the production of coffee, and very often these individuals tend to be much more supportive of ending the institution of slavery. So first of all, their profits are much larger, meaning that if they did have to make the transition to quote-unquote free labor, I mean labor that you have to pay, they could manage it, right? And in fact, over the long haul, this might give them an advantage vis-a-vis sugar producers. And related to that, coffee planters very often, they had this kind of self-image that they were somehow on the side of progress, right? So that meant also that you should support the emancipation of slaves. So there is this pressure to end slavery, but it's actually going to be a long, drawn-out process, right? So for instance, in 1826, the Brazilian government will make a treaty with Great Britain, basically agreeing to suppress the slave trade. And by 1850, they had actually stopped importing slaves, which meant that over the long haul, the institution of slavery was definitely doomed. But it would take quite a while for it to completely come to an end, right? I mean, it's not the same thing as abolishing it. And certainly if you were currently a slave, that's small consolation. I mean, just knowing that future generations might not have to suffer this. But nonetheless, right, this was kind of an important step because it did mean that money that had been allocated to the importation of slaves could now be invested in other things like coffee. So this is actually going to strengthen the coffee production sector of the economy, and by virtue of that, weakening the sugar production sector. Right, and of course, sugar producers are the strongest proponents of slavery, the ones who are most dependent on slave labor. Now, one wonders if perhaps progress, in terms of eliminating slavery, might have advanced more quickly if not for the interruption of the Paraguayan War, which ran between 1865 and 1870, and that kind of postponed consideration of the slave issue. The war was actually fought between Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay on the one side and Paraguay on the other. It really came down to border disputes and related kind of commercial activity that had led to conflict along the lower Plate River. And Paraguay, shall we say, was perhaps more committed to winning this war than the other parties involved. It basically committed itself to war of attrition, whereby it basically refused to surrender. It's like, we're just going to keep fighting until we don't have any men left to throw into battle. And in fact, it was only because the dictator ruler of Paraguay, Francisco Solano Lopez, died in 1870 that the conflict came to an end. And by then, more than half of the adult male population of Paraguay had been killed. In any event, at this point, Brazil could return to dealing with the slave issue. Right, so there would be continued progress. For instance, in 1871, there was a law freeing slaves owed by the crown. It also decreed the legal freedom for future children of slaves, but it would be a gradual emancipation. These children would have to work on plantations until the age of 21. So again, it's a small incremental step, but of little consolation to someone who happens to be a slave. And over the next 2 decades, support for the abolition movement, for eliminating slavery, would grow. And among those supporting it would be military officers, right, who very often saw themselves as progressive and really felt that the institution of slavery was doing, so it wasn't just purely out of concern for the slaves, but kind of a feeling that the institution is kind of holding back Brazil's development politically, economically, and socially. And we should note there were other kinds of activities going on, people like trying to help free slaves and so forth. And eventually, to kind of make the long story short, pressure was growing to end the institution. But interestingly enough, the one who finally pulled the trigger was not the emperor, Pedro II. As it turned out, at some point, he had to go to Europe for medical treatment. And while he was away, his daughter, Princess Isabel, acting as regent, pushed through a law abolishing it once and for all in 1888. This is going to have consequences, however, for the monarchy. Part of this has to do with the execution of the new law, right? So, for instance, the emancipation of slaves did not provide for financial compensation to their owners, and that is going to make them very resentful. And the problem was there were other issues that were dividing Brazil. One of them had to do with the Roman Catholic Church that found itself at odds with the monarchy over educational policies. And then finally, there were many within the military who simply did not like Pedro II's daughter, who was also the heir to the throne. She was very unpopular and distrusted by them, partly because they felt that they should allow for more military influence in setting policy and so forth. And so, these various factors are going to come together to bring about a coup, which takes place, and boy, we're seeing a lot of these, aren't we, in November 1889, which basically sends Pedro II into exile in France, and the establishment of the Brazilian Republic, which is going to run between 1891 and 1930. Now, this republic is going to be dominated politically by wealthy elites, among whom coffee planters are going to feature prominently, right? So what they come up with is a kind of power-sharing arrangement between the different state governors, but wherein the federal government will be dominated by 2 states in particular. And so it's kind of the idea that the president will always be chosen alternatively between these 2 states of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. The other 18 governors would have a fair amount of political latitude within their respective states. To some degree, they would be semi-autonomous. And then finally, we should note, and this is a major aspect of why the country is politically dominated by a small number of wealthy elites, the franchise is limited to those who are literate, which at this time in Brazil's history means that the vast majority of the population are not qualified to vote. And from this point forward, from beginning to end, the Brazilian Republic is going to be dominated by coffee planters. Coffee is king. The coffee industry will dominate politically and economically. And during this period, Brazil is producing over 3/4 of the world's coffee. And so the expectation is that government should pursue policies that are favorable to coffee planters, to coffee producers. Right? So for instance, they have to worry about overproduction, related to which the government promotes policies designed to keep the price of coffee high. Because if you have overproduction, in theory, that should drive down the price of coffee, meaning less profit for coffee planters and so forth. This, however, requires large loans from foreign banks in order to maintain production. And at some point, the high prices, the high price of coffee coming from Brazil is going to encourage competition from other Latin American producers who are seeking to undercut the Brazilians with a cheaper product. And that's going to mean you're going to need more price support in Brazil, which means the government needs to draw upon more revenue. Well, that revenue is mostly coming from the underdeveloped non-coffee sectors of the economy, right? So that is creating a lot of resentment among anyone who's not engaged in the coffee trade. Now, alongside of this, we're starting to see pretty significant urban growth, right? We are seeing the beginnings of some industry in the cities, and that is going to attract foreign immigrants to Brazil. And eventually, as we saw in the case of Argentina, cities are going to become the centers of labor discontent. And that will culminate in 1917 with a general strike in Sao Paulo, to which, what a surprise, the government responds militarily. So really what's happening here, and it's not that different from what we've seen in the cases of Argentina and Mexico, right, where the army is to some degree dominated by progressive military officers who, if at some point they feel the government is failing to deal with the various kinds of social, political, economic problems that are confronting the country, are going to initiate a military coup. In this case, the military feels that the government is not sufficiently dealing with urban and industrial social problems, resulting in 2 attempted military coups during the early 1920s. Both are going to fail, but as you might imagine, it's only a matter of time before a military coup succeeds. And again, the military sees itself as a force for progress. They're not like trying to uphold the status quo. They want to see political and economic reform. In particular, they recognize that Brazil has a problem of overdependency on a single exportable crop. And related to that, the fact that the political system has become entirely beholden to coffee producers. The thing that finally brings this to an end is the Great Depression. 1929, coffee prices fall dramatically along with currency exchange rates, at which point foreign loans become completely unavailable, right? So the whole system that's been set up here in order to kind of prop up coffee production has just had the legs taken out from under it. And it's at that point that we finally have a successful military coup in October 1930 that leaves Getúlio Vargas installed as president, and he will govern until 1945. And so the ensuing period, often referred to as the Vargas years. As with many military leaders, he is a progressive and really does desire to transform Brazil into a modern nation. Initially through constitutionalism, right, trying to operate through the system of government that had been established by the Republic, but then eventually as a dictatorship. And we should know, we do see some positive changes, but ultimately, probably the biggest problem is he doesn't actually create new political institutions that might carry on the good work after he's gone, right? Everything is too much depending on him as an individual. And so after he's gone, there is no institutional political framework whereby Brazil might move forward without him. So what are some of the things he does? He develops the non-coffee sectors of the economy. I mean, remember, one of the issues they had is we're overly dependent on coffee. He's also going to promote the production of domestic goods as a substitute for imported ones, which have become very expensive at this point, for Brazilians at least. And he is going to initiate some reforms designed to improve the situation of workers, right? Providing a legal framework for labor relations, establishing an 8-hour workday, and minimum wage. And we should note more broadly via the Constitution, kind of like what happened in Mexico, making the government responsible for protecting mineral and water rights, right? That the wealth of the nation should be for the benefit of its people, not for foreign countries. Now, initially, particularly as he moves towards dictatorship, he is going to try and define a kind of political movement around himself, right? I mean, that's not just about him, but it kind of represents some kind of broader ideological goal. Related to this, we should note that initially he enjoyed a great deal of support among reform-minded military officers, among professional middle-class groups, and also among many urban workers. But by the late 1930s, some of this support is beginning to dissipate, partly because they have other ways of promoting their interests, right? So he's going to encounter political opposition from a relatively robust Brazilian Communist Party that was founded in 1922, obviously enjoying a great deal of support among urban workers. And then on the right side, politically, we have integralism, a right-wing political movement that has kind of some fascist dimensions to it. This is actually going to be a major factor in why Vargas eventually assumes dictatorial power in 1937, right? Just simply that there's too much opposition, and he's no longer able to count on having sufficient support, that he might continue operating through the proper constitutionally based government. And as a dictator, he will become he will pretty much govern in the manner that dictators typically do, right? I mean, so his government will become more repressive. He'll employ censorship. There will be a secret police, and they won't be too shy about torturing political opponents by way of trying to justify his having become effectively a dictator. He claims that he is, really attempting to establish a new state, Estado Novo, right, and presents himself as the protector of national stability. And so moving forward, related to this idea of creating this new state, he's going to employ something most commonly associated with communist regimes, a 5-year plan, right? A 5-year plan where you set these very, very ambitious goals, in terms of raising production, whether you're talking agricultural production, industrial, whatever, right? That must be achieved within 5 years, and then you come up with a plan for how to do that, which often involves creating new industries, building factories, infrastructure, and the like. In this case, and again, as is often the case with these types of 5-year plans, the focus will be on developing heavy industry that could be used in Brazil itself. Right? So this is in some ways very similar to what is happening in the Soviet Union, for instance, during this time. He will also issue a progressive labor code, still attempting to garner support from the workers, from trade unions, and so forth. And one last thing, and this really has a lot to do with the fact that Brazil is going to align itself with the Allied forces during the Second World War. He's going to take advantage of that alliance by building up large reserves of currency through the export of foodstuffs, right? Much of it to Europe, in support of the Allies, but also because he's on friendly terms with them and he, basically picked a side, he is able to acquire foreign loans to further develop the economy. On the flip side, there is going to be, for him at least, an unfortunate consequence of having sided with the Allies during World War II. Who claimed to be fighting for democracy, fighting against fascism, fighting against dictatorship. And so this is going to help generate an expectation among Brazilians that they should be moving towards democracy. And at some point, Vargas himself is going to promise to lead the nation towards democracy and hold elections. But then at some point, and so he does seem to be moving in that direction, but at some point it becomes clear that he's kind of setting it up so that he'll be able to manipulate the outcome of the elections and retain power. And when that becomes apparent, we're going to see yet again another military coup. So following the military coup, we do see the establishment of a democratic regime. I mean, at least, in terms of, institutionally, having a representative body, elections, and so forth. A lot of continuity, though, especially economically, is still about industrialization, most of this to be foreign financed. And then even in terms of some of the key actors, right? So 1950, Vargas is back, elected president, though he's much older now. In some ways, I mean, not as capable of asserting his authority as prior. We should note one very important development during his presidency, the creation of Petrobras, a state-owned petroleum exploration company. So in some ways, a very similar development to what we saw in Mexico. And then, unfortunately for him, he gets involved in a scandal which saw a prominent civilian journalist assassinated. He's held to some degree accountable for that, in connection with which the military demands his resignation. Instead, he takes his own life in 1954, though leaving behind a public testament wherein he really promotes the idea that he was simply a protector of the poor and of the national interest. The new government will be under Juscelino Kubitschek, who probably the most important development during his presidency will be the construction of a new capital, Brasilia, which will be located in the interior, pretty much in the Amazon jungle, actually. So this project is initiated in 1957. And so this is going to be a major construction project, infrastructure project. It's going to require the creation of a vast road system, kind of, linking it to the rest of the country. There's some people who would say it was maybe a bit of a foolhardy enterprise. I've never been there. My wife has. She said it was very nice. But it really is, in a sense, cut off, apparently, even until today, from the rest of the country. But in any event, there you go, new capital. Another important development under Kubitschek is going to be the creation of a large automobile industry. So the idea that Brazilians can buy cars produced in Brazil instead of foreign, cars produced in foreign countries. Alongside of this, the continued growth of cities, kind of a growing working class, and a political system that really is not very good at addressing the needs of workers and urban poor. And in fact, what is really interesting here, we're starting to see a kind of division politically between urban and rural. Some of this is actually, a lot of this reflects that they have different concerns, different interests. But some of this also a consequence of how the Constitution actually structured government, wherein when you have elections, you tend to end up with the presidency being determined by urban voters, and the Congress, the majority of the Congress being determined by rural voters, right? So very often at odds. At some point, there will be attempts at somehow, needling the thread, as they say, in terms of how to appease both sides. Probably the individual who made the first serious attempt at this is João Goulart, who at the end tended to side more with rural voters in the sense that he was, going to promote land reform. This was in 1964. But this is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, not just urban voters. Many of whom perhaps felt that he should have devoted more resources to their needs. And that is something certainly that political conservatives and moderates would have been more comfortable with. They really especially objected to any kind of major land reform or any major political reform. In the end, they were not that happy with Goulart. And then Goulart fell foul of the military hierarchy, largely because he challenged their ability to intervene in the political system. And as you might expect, that resulted in another military coup in March of 1964, when the military seized control of the government. So that is a pretty good place to stop. Certainly corresponds to where the chapter ends. And so with that, just reminder to make sure to check out the questions and post your responses on Blackboard.